The hall had been designed to erase friction. Light fell from long fluorescent strips embedded in the ceiling, each tube humming with a faint, continuous insistence. The glow was neither warm nor cold, it was exact. It flattened shadows, eliminated ambiguity, and reduced every surface to its function. The polished floor reflected it back in hard, clinical lines, doubling the geometry of the space until it felt infinite. Sound behaved differently here. It did not echo freely, it returned in measured fragments, clipped and controlled, as if even noise required authorization. The soldiers stood in rows that obeyed the architecture. Boots aligned. Shoulders squared. Chins level. Rifles held at a uniform angle that had been practiced into muscle memory long before thought could intervene. Each body was a repetition of the last, adjusted by millimeters, corrected by drills that had erased hesitation. Identity had been processed out of them, filed down until only posture remained. Even breathing seemed synchronized, shallow and restrained, as though the air itself might be inspected. At the far end of the hall, the doors opened without ceremony. He entered without announcement. The general's presence was not loud. It did not need to be. Authority traveled with him in subtler ways, in the measured cadence of his steps, in the way the air seemed to recalibrate around his movement. His shoes struck the polished floor with a controlled firmness. Not hurried. Not slow. Precise. Each step carried the weight of a system that did not question itself. The sound of those shoes became the axis of the room. Step. Pause. Step. He moved down the first row, his gaze passing over uniforms, insignias, faces that did not react. He did not linger. He did not nod. His attention was not a reward, it was a mechanism. He registered compliance the way a machine might, efficiently, without attachment. A color slightly misaligned. A grip too tight. A breath held a fraction too long. He corrected nothing aloud. The soldiers felt it anyway. The rifles were identical. Matte black, unadorned, held at the same angle across every chest. They were extensions of posture, not tools. Instruments of duty reduced to form. In the light, they absorbed rather than reflected, swallowing detail, refusing distinction. The rifles did not belong to the soldiers. The soldiers belonged to the rifles. Step. Pause. Step. He moved to the next row. The lighting above him hummed, steady and indifferent. It revealed everything and explained nothing. Faces became surfaces. Eyes became reflections. There was no place to hide in that brightness, and yet something essential always remained concealed, not by darkness, but by excess visibility. Too much light could obscure as effectively as none at all. Halfway down the third row, the rhythm shifted. It was not visible at first. Not to anyone without the authority to notice. The general's step paused a fraction longer than before. The sound of his shoe lingered against the floor, stretching into the silence between breaths. It was a deviation small enough to be dismissed, but the room registered it. Shoulders tightened imperceptibly. Fingers adjusted against rifle grips. The system sensed interruption before it understood it. He resumed walking. One more step. Then another. He passed her. She stood as the others did, back straight, chin level, rifle held with exact precision. Nothing in her posture invited attention. Nothing in her expression broke formation. She had learned the discipline of stillness to a degree that bordered on absence. To look at her was to see compliance rendered perfectly. He had almost moved on. Almost. The emblem was small. It sat just above the seam of her uniform pocket, where regulation allowed for certain distinctions. It was not meant for visibility. It carried no color that would catch the light, no raised edges that would draw the eye. It was embedded, subdued, nearly indistinguishable from the fabric itself. To most, it would have passed unnoticed. Another detail dissolved into uniformity. But it did not belong there. Not in this line. Not in this place. The general stopped. The halt was absolute. The echo of his last step dissipated into the ceiling, leaving behind a silence that pressed downward, heavy and deliberate. The soldiers did not move. They could not. The system did not permit reaction without command. But the stillness changed. It thickened, acquiring weight. He turned his head slightly. Not enough to break posture. just enough to confirm what he had already seen. The emblem. Recognition was immediate. It did not require memory, it bypassed it. Some symbols are not learned. They are imposed. They exist outside the visible hierarchy, carrying meanings that are neither spoken nor recorded in accessible files. They belong to a different layer of the institution, one that operates without acknowledgement. His gaze lingered for the first time since entering the hall. It moved from the emblem to the rifle. The rifle was perfect. Alignment exact. Grip steady. No tremor in the hands that held it. Discipline without flaw. The kind of precision that suggested not just training, but survival, an understanding that deviation had consequences beyond correction. Then to her face. Neutral. Composed. Unreadable. She did not look at him. Regulations did not allow it. Her eyes remained fixed forward, anchored to a point that existed only to prevent deviation. There was no visible awareness of his attention, no shift in breath, no tightening of the jaw. But she knew. The emblem ensured that. Silence extended. It was no longer the absence of sound. It was a presence, structured, intentional, filling the space between them with unspoken recognition. Around them, the line remained intact, but its meaning had altered. Uniformity had been interrupted, not by movement, but by significance. He took a step back. A small movement. Controlled. It broke the linear progression of his inspection, creating a gap in the sequence. The geometry of the room adjusted around it, the symmetry disrupted by a decision that had not yet been declared. His shoes marked the shift. Authority, momentarily reconsidering its path. He looked again at the emblem. There was no mistaking it. Not its shape, not its placement, not the implications embedded within its design. It did not signify rank. It did not denote achievement in any recognized sense. It marked involvement in something that did not officially exist, an operation without public record, without acknowledgement, without accountability. It should not have been visible, which meant it had been allowed to remain, which meant someone had made a decision. The general's jaw tightened, though only slightly. The kind of movement that did not register as emotion, only as recalibration. Systems do not feel. They adjust. Name, he said. The word cut through the silence with surgical precision. No preamble. No explanation. A test, not a question. Her voice came without hesitation. Lieutenant Amina Rahman. Measured. Clear. Devoid of inflection. The name settled into the space between them, carrying with it the weight of identification, an individual briefly reintroduced into a system designed to erase individuality. He did not respond immediately. The pause returned. Longer this time. The soldiers in the adjacent rows remained immobile, but the stillness had become strained. The inspection was no longer routine. It had become something else, something unscripted, and therefore dangerous. The general's gaze moved once more, from her face to the emblem. Then away. He stepped forward. The sound of his shoes resumed, re-establishing the rhythm that governed the room. Step. Pause. Step. The sequence continued, as if uninterrupted, as if the deviation had been absorbed and corrected. But the space he left behind did not return to its previous state. It held the moment, the recognition, the unspoken question. Lieutenant Rahman did not move. Her rifle remained aligned, her posture unchanged. The emblem sat where it had always been, quiet and immovable, carrying its meaning without display. The line reasserted itself. Uniform. Ordered. Controlled. From a distance, nothing had changed. The inspection proceeded. The general advanced. The soldiers remained identical in stance and silence. The hall continued to function as designed, a place where individuals were rendered into components, each one interchangeable, each one accountable only to the structure that contained them. But within that structure, something had resisted. Not through defiance. Not through movement. Through presence. A mark that could not be erased without acknowledgement. A history that refused to disappear into uniformity. The fluorescent lights hummed on, indifferent. The rifles remained steady. The shoes continued their measured path across the polished floor. And the line held. Until it didn't. From above, the formation would appear perfect, rows of soldiers reduced to symmetry, their differences dissolved into alignment. A system functioning without visible flaw. But embedded within that order was a fracture, small and precise, invisible to those who did not know where to look. Institutions rely on repetition to maintain control. They flatten variation into compliance, compress identity into posture, and reward silence as stability. The line is their ideal, clean, predictable, unquestioning. But there are always marks that resist compression. Not loudly, not visibly, just enough to remain. And once seen, they cannot be unseen. The inspection did not end. It stopped. The distinction was subtle, but absolute. The general's steps ceased midway through the fourth row, the rhythm severed without announcement. The echo of his last footfall lingered against the polished floor, then dissolved into the fluorescent hum above. The line held, suspended in its own discipline, awaiting instruction that did not immediately come. He did not turn toward the formation. He spoke forward. "Lieutenant Ramon. Step out." The command moved through the hall without volume, carried instead by authority sharpened into precision. It did not need repetition. There was a pause. Not hesitation. Transition. Her rifle moved first. A controlled shift, disengaging from the rigid alignment of the line. The motion was exact, economical, practiced into invisibility. Then her foot stepped forward, breaking formation by a single measured distance. The symmetry of the row absorbed the absence without collapsing. Systems are built to withstand small removals. She did not look at the others. No one looked at her. The general resumed walking, not back through the line, but away from it, toward the far end of the hall where the doors stood closed, matte and unmarked. His shoes reclaimed their cadence. Step. Pause. Step. She followed. 2 paces behind. No more. No less. The distance was not arbitrary. It was institutional. It defined rank without needing to declare it. It preserved order even in deviation. The sound of her boots joined his, slightly softer, slightly delayed. A second rhythm beneath the first. The hall stretched ahead of them, lengthening with each step. The soldiers remained behind, fixed in place, their stillness now recontextualized. What had been uniformity now read as containment, a holding pattern for something unresolved. The doors opened as they approached. No guard. No announcement. They parted cleanly, admitting them into a space that did not belong to the hall. The room was smaller than expected. Windowless. The fluorescent lighting was different here, dimmer, more focused, directed downward onto a single rectangular table positioned at the center. The walls were bare, painted in a muted gray that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Sound did not echo. It stopped. The air felt heavier. Conditioned. Isolated. The door closed behind them with a soft, mechanical finality. Not loud. Not abrupt. Just complete. The seal was total. Whatever existed outside the room no longer applied within it. The general moved to the far side of the table. He did not sit. He placed his hands lightly on the surface, fingers spread just enough to suggest control without exertion. The table was clean, unmarked, its surface reflecting a faint distortion of the light above. It was not designed for comfort. It was designed for clarity, for the reduction of variables. She remained standing where she had stopped, 1 pace from the edge of the table. Her rifle was no longer present. It had been surrendered at the threshold without acknowledgement, absorbed into the system as quietly as it had been issued. Without it, her posture remained unchanged, but the absence was visible. The rifle had been an extension of duty. Its removal exposed something less defined. Human presence, stripped to its minimum. The emblem remained. The general's gaze settled on it immediately. Up close, it did not become clearer. It remained subdued, its design resisting interpretation unless one already knew what to see. It was not meant to communicate. It was meant to confirm. He spoke without looking at her face. That insignia is not authorized for visible wear. His voice was even. Controlled. It did not accuse. It stated. Silence answered him. Not defiance. Containment. He lifted his gaze, moving from the emblem to her eyes. She met it this time, not directly, but within the narrow allowance permitted by protocol. Enough to acknowledge the exchange. Not enough to challenge it. Do you understand the regulation? Yes, sir. Her voice carried no weight beyond the words themselves. It did not defend. It did not explain. The room held the sound briefly, then returned it to silence. The general's fingers shifted slightly against the table's surface. A minimal adjustment. The kind that precedes recalibration. Then explain its presence. The question was narrower than it appeared. Not why it existed. Why it was here. Another pause. Measured. Deliberate. It was not removed, sir. The answer did not satisfy the structure of the question. It bypassed it. His eyes narrowed, though only slightly. The movement altered nothing in his expression, but it changed the temperature of the room. By whom? She did not respond immediately. The silence lengthened, acquiring density. It was no longer passive. It pressed against the walls, against the table, against the space between them. It carried information by omission, by refusal to collapse into speech. Finally, no order was given to remove it. The phrasing was precise. Careful. It shifted responsibility without assigning it. The general straightened slightly, his hands leaving the table. He took a single step to the side, altering his position relative to her. The movement disrupted the symmetry of the room, creating a new angle of observation. The emblem remained centered. Do you know what it signifies? He asked. Yes, sir. State it. Another pause. This one longer. Not uncertainty. Calculation. It denotes participation in a classified operation. Her voice remained steady, but the words carried weight now, compressed, restricted, released only within the confines of the room. Designation, he pressed. Redacted, sir. The answer was not evasion. It was adherence to a layer of protocol that existed beyond the visible hierarchy. The general exhaled, though the sound was minimal. A controlled release. The kind that accompanies recognition of a boundary. He moved again, circling the table slowly, his shoes muted against the floor. The rhythm returned, but altered, less predictable, less linear. He was no longer inspecting. He was assessing. You understand, he said, that operations of that classification are not acknowledged within standard command structures. Yes, sir. Which places your current assignment outside expected parameters. Yes, sir. Each response landed with identical cadence. No variation. No emphasis. Compliance rendered without interpretation. He stopped directly in front of her. Closer now. The emblem between them. And yet, he said, you stand in an open inspection line. The statement was not a question. She did not answer it. Silence expanded again, filling the space with its quiet insistence. It was not empty. It was active, a form of resistance that did not require opposition. By withholding, she maintained control over what could not be spoken. The general studied her face. There was nothing to read. No trace of the operation. No visible history. Only discipline. He stepped back. The distance re-established the structure of the room, restoring a semblance of order to the imbalance that had formed. Were you instructed to report here? He asked. Yes, sir. By whom? Another pause. Shorter this time. Orders were issued through secured channels. Again, the answer redirected without refusing. He nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement, not of agreement, but of the limits of the exchange. The room settled. The tension did not dissipate. It stabilized. There are spaces within institutions designed not for resolution, but for containment. Rooms where questions are asked not to uncover truth, but to define its boundaries. Where silence is not absence, but structure, holding in place what cannot be processed without consequence. The table between them was not a barrier. It was an instrument. It measured distance. It enforced balance. It ensured that neither could fully cross into the other's position without disrupting the system that held them both. The emblem remained visible, unaltered. Its presence in the room was an anomaly, but not an accident. It carried with it the weight of decisions made elsewhere, by mechanisms that did not submit to standard review. It signified actions taken beyond the reach of official record, actions that could not be integrated without compromising the narrative the institution required. The general looked at it one last time. Then at her. "Return to the line," he said. The instruction came without explanation. No resolution. No acknowledgement of what had passed between them. Just a directive. She nodded once. "Sir." She turned with precision, her movement as controlled as it had been when she stepped out of formation. The door opened as she approached, responding without delay. The seal broke, allowing the sound of the hall to re-enter, distant, structured, unchanged. She stepped through. The door closed behind her. The room remained. Empty now, but not neutral. It held the residue of the exchange, the questions unasked, the answers withheld, the recognition that had occurred without declaration. From the outside, it was just another space within the base. Unremarkable. Functional. Necessary. But rooms like this do not exist to resolve contradictions. They exist to contain them. To isolate what cannot be reconciled with the system's visible order. To ensure that truth, when it threatens structure, is kept within walls that do not speak. And beyond those walls, the line waits, unchanged, unbroken, ready to absorb whatever returns to it. As if nothing had ever left. The office was not meant for thought. It was designed for processing. A single desk. A terminal embedded flush into its surface. Cabinets aligned along the walls with a symmetry that discouraged hesitation. The lighting was softer than the inspection hall but no less precise, angled to illuminate documents without casting shadows deep enough to conceal detail. Even the chair, rigid-backed and narrowly contoured, enforced posture rather than comfort. The general remained standing. The emblem had followed him here, not physically, but as an imprint that refused to dissolve into routine. It lingered in the space between actions, a disruption carried forward from the closed room into this one. It altered the function of the desk, the meaning of the files stacked upon it. He activated the terminal. The screen responded instantly, its surface clearing into a neutral field before resolving into access prompts. Clearance codes entered. Authentication confirmed. Layers opened, each one thinner than expected, as though depth itself had been reduced. He did not search by name. Names could be erased. He searched by classification. The designation surfaced without resistance. Not hidden. Not protected. Simply absent from any visible index, requiring knowledge of where not to look. The system did not deny access. It redirected it into a corridor of fragments. The first file opened. Black lines dominated the page. Redactions, not crude, but deliberate. Rectangles of absence placed with precision, obscuring not just information, but context. Sentences began and ended without continuity, verbs stripped from actions, subjects removed from consequence. What remained was structure without substance. Operation. Redacted. Status. Concluded. Outcome. Non-reportable. The language was exact. Empty. He scrolled. Paragraphs collapsed into themselves, each one offering the appearance of record while withholding its meaning. Dates were visible. Locations were not. Casualty numbers appeared without designation. No indication of who had been counted or why. The general's jaw tightened slightly. Not at what he saw. At what had been arranged for him to see. He opened the second file. A field report. Less redacted, but no less controlled. The tone shifted, more immediate, less refined. It carried the residue of urgency, filtered through bureaucratic restraint. Sentences shorter. Observations reduced to acceptable parameters. Engagement initiated under directive, redacted. Civilian presence detected. Density, high. Deviation from protocol noted. The words sat on the screen without explanation, each one a fragment that implied more than it revealed. Deviation. The term was precise. It carried judgment without context. It marked a boundary crossed, but did not define the line. He continued reading. Command issued to proceed. Countermand executed at field level. The general's eyes paused. Not on the words themselves, but on the space between them. Command issued. Countermand executed. Two actions. One official. One not. The document did not reconcile them. It placed them side by side, then moved on, as though proximity was sufficient explanation. He scrolled further. Civilian extraction initiated. Hostile engagement escalated. Casualty report incomplete. Incomplete. Not unknown. Not unavailable. Incomplete. A deliberate absence. The general stepped back from the desk, the movement small but significant in the confined space. The chair remained untouched behind him, its presence an unaccepted concession. He did not sit. Sitting would imply acceptance of the frame presented to him. Standing allowed distance. He turned to the cabinets. Physical records. Older. Less adaptable. He opened one drawer. File folders arranged with mechanical precision, each labeled in uniform typeface, each spine identical in thickness. The illusion of completeness was maintained through consistency. It suggested that everything had been accounted for. He selected a folder at random. Opened it. Inside, pages. Paper. Ink. Permanent. Or intended to be. The first page bore a familiar structure. Header, classification, summary. But the ink told a different story. Certain lines had been struck through, not erased, but overwritten. Amendments layered over original entries, the corrections visible if one looked closely enough. Ink did not forget. It accumulated. He turned the page. A photograph. Grainy. Low resolution. Taken at a distance. Structures partially collapsed. Smoke rising in uneven columns. Figures moving through debris, indistinct, blurred by motion and distance. No identifiers. No markers to distinguish civilian from combatant. But there, at the edge of the frame, a posture. Recognizable not by face, but by alignment. Shoulders squared against chaos. Movement directed not toward engagement, but away from it, toward a cluster of smaller figures, partially obscured by smoke. The general's eyes narrowed. The image offered no confirmation. It did not need to. He turned the page. A handwritten note, appended beneath the printed report. Unusual. Unauthorized, in most contexts. The script was controlled, but not uniform, written quickly, under conditions that did not allow for refinement. Orders conflicted with ground reality. Civilian evacuation prioritized. Command override necessary. No signature. No attribution. Just the statement. Direct. Unfiltered. The general closed the folder. Not abruptly. Deliberately. He returned to the terminal. The digital records resumed their pattern of omission. More files. More fragments. Each one contributing a piece of a narrative that refused to assemble into a coherent whole. Actions without actors. Decisions without ownership. But patterns emerged. Not through what was stated. Through what repeated. Civilian presence. Protocol deviation. Command override. Extraction. Each term appeared across multiple documents, detached from specific context, but consistent in implication. They formed a structure beneath the surface, a parallel account that existed without formal acknowledgement. And within that structure, an absence shaped like a person. No name attached. No direct reference. But the outline was there. Defined by action. Reinforced by omission. The general stepped back again, the room seeming smaller now, its order more restrictive. The desk, the files, the terminal, they no longer functioned as tools of clarity. They were instruments of construction, assembling a version of events that preserved the institution's coherence at the expense of its truth. He looked down at his hands. Still. Controlled. Then back at the screen. The final file opened without prompt. A summary. Condensed. Sanitized. Operation concluded within acceptable parameters. Collateral impact within projected range. No further action required. The language was definitive. It closed the narrative, it erased the need for continuation. But it did not align with what he had already seen. The photograph. The handwritten note. The repeated deviations. They existed outside the summary, unaccounted for, unintegrated. The system had chosen its version. and sealed it. The general reached forward and closed the file. The screen returned to its neutral state, offering no indication that anything had been accessed, nothing that could be traced beyond authorized parameters. The system preserved itself through silence as effectively as it did through record. He turned away. The room remained unchanged, order intact, surfaces clean, files aligned. It projected stability, continuity, control. But the meaning had shifted. The emblem was no longer an anomaly. It was evidence, not of misconduct, of divergence, of a decision made within the system that the system could not absorb without contradiction. Lieutenant Ramon's presence in the inspection line was not an oversight. It was a residue, something left behind by an operation that had been closed on paper but not in consequence. She should not have been visible. The structure did not permit it. And yet, she stood, aligned with the others, rifle held at the same angle, posture indistinguishable, except for the mark that refused to be removed. A record that did not exist, carried into plain sight. The general moved to the door. His hand paused on the handle, not from uncertainty, but from recognition. What he had reviewed was not incomplete due to error. It was incomplete by design. The institution did not fail to record. It selected what to remember. He opened the door. The corridor beyond was identical to every other, clean, ordered, unmarked by the contents of the room he left behind. The system did not allow its internal contradictions to surface in its architecture. It contained them within designated spaces, ensuring that the visible structure remained intact. He stepped out. The door closed behind him. From a distance, the base functioned as intended. Orders issued. Protocol followed. Records maintained. The appearance of coherence preserved through layers of documentation that reinforced one another. But beneath that surface, another system operated. One that did not record courage when it conflicted with command. One that reframed defiance as deviation. One that preserved obedience not because it was right, but because it was legible. Institutions do not forget. They choose. They compress events into narratives that sustain their authority, discarding what cannot be reconciled with their design. They write permanence in ink, then overwrite it when necessary, leaving traces only for those who know where to look. And sometimes, what remains is not the record, but the person who survived it, standing in a line that was never meant to include them. Visible, unremoved, unresolved. The hall had not changed. It had been preserved. Fluorescent light continued its steady descent from the ceiling, flattening every surface into clarity without warmth. The polished floor held its reflection with the same sterile precision. Rows of soldiers stood exactly as before, boots aligned, shoulders squared, rifles angled into perfect repetition. Nothing moved. Nothing corrected itself. The system had held its breath and decided not to exhale. When the doors opened, the sound carried further than it should have. A soft mechanical release, followed by the measured return of footsteps. The general entered alone. His pace was slower now. Not visibly so to an untrained eye, but enough that the rhythm altered. Each step lingered half a second longer against the floor, extending the space between movement and consequence. The sound of his shoes no longer imposed order. It questioned it. Step. Pause. Step. The line did not react. It absorbed him as it had before, presenting the same geometry of compliance. Faces forward. Eyes fixed. No acknowledgement of absence, no sign that anything had been removed and returned. But the air had shifted. Not in temperature. In meaning. The hall was no longer a neutral container of discipline. It carried residue now, something unrecorded, something that had passed through its structure and returned altered. The light exposed it without defining it. The silence held it without release. The general moved down the first row. He did not inspect. He observed. The difference was not procedural. It was internal. Where before his gaze had measured alignment, it now registered presence. Subtle deviations that would once have been corrected passed without note. A shoulder fractionally higher. A grip slightly too rigid. He did not stop. The system allowed this. It could not distinguish between oversight and intention. Step. Pause. Step. The second row. The rifles remained identical, matte, unreflective, absorbing the light rather than returning it. Instruments of duty, held with the same precision that had defined the hall before his departure. But now, their uniformity felt imposed rather than natural. The alignment was no longer invisible. It was enforced. He moved past them. The third row approached. The rhythm slowed further. Not enough to disrupt the line. Enough to mark a decision. She stood where she had been. Lieutenant Ramon. Second position from the end. Rifle returned to her hands, held at the same angle, her posture indistinguishable from those around her. The emblem remained in place, quiet and unaltered, embedded in the fabric above her pocket. It had not been removed. It had not been questioned. It had not been acknowledged. The system had chosen not to see it. He stopped. The halt was precise. No echo followed. The room absorbed the absence of motion as completely as it had once absorbed his steps. The silence that formed around him was not empty. It was structured, waiting for resolution that would not arrive in expected form. He looked at her. Not past her. At her. The difference was immediate. She did not move. Her eyes remained fixed forward, her posture unchanged. But the space between them had altered. It was no longer defined by hierarchy alone. It carried recognition, unspoken, but fixed. The emblem sat between them. Visible. Unhidden. A record that had refused erasure. The general's gaze dropped to the rifle. Then back to her face. The rifle was perfect. The emblem was not. That was the point. He spoke. Lieutenant. One word. No rank appended. No command embedded. An acknowledgement. Her response came without delay. Sir. The word held. It did not invite continuation. It confirmed presence. Silence returned, heavier than before. The soldiers in the adjacent positions remained immobile, but the tension within the line had shifted. It was no longer the tension of inspection. It was the tension of witnessing something that did not conform to the system's script. The general took a step forward. Closer. Breaking the fixed distance that defined interaction within the line. His shoes marked the movement with quiet certainty, the sound no longer rhythmic, but singular. He reached out. The motion was deliberate, controlled, stripped of any gesture that could be misread as impulsive. His hand moved toward her chest, not toward her, but toward the emblem. He did not touch it. He stopped just short. The space between his fingers and the fabric was minimal, but absolute. Contact would have transformed the act into correction, into enforcement. The absence of contact preserved something else. Recognition. His hand lowered. He stepped back. The distance re-established itself, but not as it had been before. It no longer carried the same authority. It had been altered by proximity. He spoke again. Maintain position. 2 words. A command. But not the one the system expected. There was no instruction to remove the emblem. No directive to report. No correction issued. The words carried a different weight, one that did not align with procedure. They affirmed her presence within the line as it was, not as it should have been. Her response was immediate. Yes, sir. No change in tone. No deviation in posture. But the meaning shifted. The command had been received. The system registered it, and could not reconcile it. The general turned. His movement was clean, decisive. He resumed his walk down the line, the rhythm returning, but altered permanently. Step. Pause. Step. Behind him, nothing changed. The soldiers remained in formation. The rifles held their angle. The light continued its steady illumination. But the structure had been disrupted. Not visibly. Not audibly. In its logic. The inspection continued to its end without further interruption. No other deviations were noted. No additional commands issued. The general reached the far end of the hall, the doors opening once more to admit him into the corridor beyond. He did not look back. He did not need to. The act had already occurred. Small. Contained. Irreversible. The doors closed behind him, sealing the hall once more into its controlled environment. The soldiers remained, their alignment intact, their posture unchanged. Lieutenant Ramon stood among them, indistinguishable except for the mark that remained visible, now not by oversight, but by decision. The emblem had been seen. And allowed. The system would respond. Not immediately. Not directly. It would adjust its records. Reevaluate its classifications. Attempt to reconcile the inconsistency introduced into its structure. There would be questions, but not the kind asked in open rooms. Reviews would occur in spaces without windows, in language that concealed more than it revealed. The act would not be recorded as defiance. It would not be recorded at all. But its consequences would move outward, through channels designed to contain them, altering decisions not yet made, shaping outcomes not yet visible. From a distance, nothing had changed. The base continued its function. Orders issued. Protocol followed. Lines formed and reformed in perfect symmetry. The appearance of control remained intact, preserved through repetition and silence. But within that repetition, a variation had been introduced. A choice. Not loud. Not declared. Precise. Institutions do not collapse under confrontation. They adapt to it. Or they resist. And in that resistance, they reveal themselves. The general's walk through the line had been performed twice. The first time as routine. The second as decision. The difference between them was not visible in posture or pace. It existed in the space between action and intent, in the moment where authority could have enforced compliance and chose, instead, to recognize what could not be erased. He did not change the system. He disrupted it. Slightly. Enough. Because systems are not undone by force alone. They are altered by the refusal to comply with their silences. One step. One pause. One mark allowed to remain. And once allowed, it cannot be unseen. It cannot be undone. It remains, waiting for the next decision.